Hello, everyone. For Easter, I'm going to be making a lecture for religion. Religion is one of my favorite topics. So, before we begin, here's a couple of disclaimers. First is that I am not omniscient. I don't know everything there is to know about religion, but I do know quite a lot. But yeah, this is an incomplete thing. It's just supposed to be like building on the knowledge that you have. And secondly, this is not supposed to be all about arguments, mostly about frames, ways that you can look at religion and understand religion. Next is no single religion is right. And I would say that all religions are equally valid and equally weird anyway. And when it comes to religion, it's always very subjective. We're going to be talking about mystical experiences. So ultimately, nobody is right with regard to religion. And lastly, when you are doing debates about religion, do not be mean, do not be disrespectful to other people's religions, stuff like that. You can criticize them institutionally, but don't criticize individuals for believing in religion. That's like a basic rule in equity. Just don't do it. Okay. So the first part of this will be all about defining religion. So let me talk about the outline for this first. Why is it important to talk about the definition? I will talk about the concept called bongoism, which you can find in anthropology. I will also talk about Emil Durkheim's definition and my own issues with Durkheim's definition. And lastly, I encourage you to choose your own definition depending on the needs of the debate motion or your needs in whatever conversation that you have. So, firstly, why is it important to talk about religion, especially the definition of religion? It's important because when we're talking about the rights that people have as a result of freedom of religion, stuff like that, there is a gray area with respect to who can get which rights. So, for example, what is the legal status of Pastafarianism? So, if you don't know, there is a quote unquote religion. Some people call it a parody religion. Some people actually believe in this genuinely, called the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. And believers of the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster are called Pastafarians. So, what is the legal status of that? So, if you believe that the universe was created through a flying spaghetti monster, should you have tax exemptions? Should you have the same level of respect that you would give Buddhists or Christians or Muslims, etc.? But also, if you find this kind of photo offensive, and this is Jesus, but it's a bunch of noodles. If you find this photo offensive, is it part of my religious freedom to offend you? So, what is the extent of religious freedoms? And is it a religious belief worth protecting that I make fun of other religions? That's the whole thing. So, that's why it's important to talk about. But next, I'm going to talk about bongoism. Bongoism is something that happens a lot in anthropology because what they found in anthropology was one of the problems they have is whenever they create a definition for there would be an obscure exception to that rule. So it's increasingly difficult to find a definition. And by the end, you would have made a definition that is so broad that it would be meaningless. The reason why it's called bongoism is whenever you give a definition, someone can just say, that's not how the bongo does it. So insert increasingly obscure tribe or increasingly obscure culture here. That's why it's bongo is. It's just a bunch of nonsense, but it's a placeholder for the kind of rebuttal that we would see in these kind of spaces. But really, what we're talking about here is an issue of polymorphism, where religion can have many different forms depending on where you might be. And whatever definition you can think of, there's always a criticism or there's always an exception. It's always either too broad or too narrow, and often at the same time. So, is religion defined by a belief in a deity? How about Buddhism? They don't really believe in a deity, right? What about a belief in the afterlife? So some Jehovah's Witnesses do not believe in that. Is it a matter of faith? Some would argue that believing in science is a matter of faith as well. Although you can say that there's evidence, it's evidence based, but Some philosophers would argue that you can have all the evidence and still doubt it. So at some point, you have to believe it as a matter of faith, right? This is epistemology. How do you really know what you know? How do you really know that whatever science is real or if it's a law? Because what science does, it's inductive reasoning. It's not really deduction, right? You're just saying that, oh, we've replicated this experiment 10 million times. Therefore, we're sure that this happens, but you can't be 100% sure because there might be a situation where the experiment is not replicated, which is why in science, it's very difficult to say that there's a law of something. It's always the theory of relativity. We don't call it the law of relativity. So at some point, if you believe in the theory of relativity, ultimately it's faith, right? You believe that the evidence that's available ultimately point to the truth of the theory of relativity. So some would argue, dare a bend, that science is a religion. But why does this happen? Why do we have polymorphism? It's because religion is an artificial Western concept. Like religion was created by scholars for their intellectual purposes, and sometimes they're called antiquities or idolatry. And the way that we use words to describe religion either creates a narrative of what culture has that religion. So if you call them an antiquity or if you call it idolatry, you're calling it old or uncivilized, stuff like that. But also, a lot of these scholars look at their own religion and imposed it on other faiths, which is why you have this problem where like Buddhism, they don't really believe in a deity. Taoism is more of a philosophy rather than like a script of what happened in the world. And this is like the creed that I believe in. So the definition of religion was based on how similar or different it is from Christianity. I think not necessarily Catholicism, probably Christianity or the Abrahamic faiths. But anyway, Emil Durkheim said that a religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, which unite them in one single moral community called a church, and all those who adhere to them. So there are three components. One is the belief in the sacred, the second is practices related to the sacred, and the third is moral community. And when we talk about sacred things, we're talking about supernatural stuff or things that take the place of the supernatural stuff. But there are some criticisms to this. Again, this is bongoism, but you can have a variety of exceptions that you would still probably consider as religion. Here are some examples. Let me talk about black masses. I'm sorry for the buts, but yeah, there are blasphemous parodies on Catholic masses. There's satires on a ceremony. There's no belief, only function. So a black mass takes the Catholic mass and inverts it, intentionally mocking the Catholic celebration. Participants use a consecrated Eucharistic host and then they desecrate it using it in obscene ways. But in 1969, in the Satanic verses, they clarified that the Black Mass is not the magical ceremony practiced by Satanists. The Satanists would only employ like the use of Black Mass as some sort of psychodrama. And a Black Mass doesn't necessarily imply that the performers are Satanists. A Black Mass is essentially a parody of a religious service, but it can be loosely applied to a satire on any religious ceremony. So the question here is this a set of beliefs and practices related to the sacred? Or does it just perform the function of a secret? So, for example, if it were true that this is performed by Satanists, and in fact, a lot of Satanists actually do have a magical ceremony that is also an inversion of Catholic masses, that might be religion. But if you take away belief and you just have the practice, is that still part of religion? Right? So, if you say that a black mass is still a religious practice, because it has all the like the functions of a Catholic mass, then you would say that it doesn't matter if you don't have a set of beliefs related to the sacred. It's enough to perform the function of the sacred, right? Another example is this idea of a personal relationship with God. And this is something to which I subscribe. right? So if you have a personal relationship with God, you necessarily do not need a community. You don't need a church in order to have a personal relationship with God. So whatever you believe in, that is already covered by our laws as religious beliefs, right? What's necessary is if you sincerely believe in this religious belief, right? It would lead the state to protect it as part of freedom of religion, even if there's no church or organization that says you need to believe in that, right? It needs to be simply a significantly and sincerely held religious belief. So this also flies in the face of what Durkheim considers religion, because there is no moral community here. There is also an argument where they say that Aldab, if you remember Aldab, and the DS supporters of former President Duterte, some people will argue that this is a religion, or at the very least a cult. And here we need to talk about something called implicit religions. And implicit religions were talked about by Edward Bailey. And there's a difference between an explicit and an implicit religion. An explicit religion is what's identified by the participants as a religion. Ito yung Durkheim stuff. But an implicit religion is a kind of religion that has the hallmarks of religion in the traditional sense, but they may be focused on elements that are secular or non-religious. So often they involve an intense level of commitment and seriousness, as well as a set of beliefs and practices. So the article to the right, which is published in Rappler by a professor in the sociology of religion, Jerry Lanuza, they were talking about how Aldab, the Aldab nation, has a set of beliefs, has a set of practices, and they even have some sort of gospel, right? They even have church time, which is whenever the Aldab segment happens on, was it Showtime? Showtime ba yun, Nina? Yeah, Showtime. Where they say there, that becomes gospel. That becomes a meme that they spread throughout their communities. There is, you even have like conspiracy theories, the same way that ordinary religious people have conspiracy theories about their religions, right? So, yeah, Aldab is so fascinating to me. I watched the entire series in one sitting because it was so fascinating to me. And yeah, I wrote 4 papers on this topic in the past. But anyway, the classification based on who and what is believed can be the basis for like further understanding. So we can imagine definitions of religion as falling under two axes or two spectra. So on the first axis, to think of it as like the x-axis. So if you've taken like a political spectrum quiz, think about it like that. So on one axis, on the left hand side, you have the communitarianness of a religion. So if you are at this end of the spectrum, you're thinking that our religion needs to have a community. On the other hand, individualism, if you fall under this part of the spectrum, you believe that even if it's just a single individual who has a sincerely held belief, this could be a religion. On the other hand, another axis, we can call this the y axis or whatever, substantive and functional. So, substantive, we can call this like the very top. This would be, it has to deal with the supernatural, it has to deal with the sacred. And functional at the bottom, you can say that it only needs to perform as a religion. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to believe in the secret. So this is where you would get your outdogs, your implicit religions, your black masons, and what have you. So based on this, substantive versus functional, substantive is based on what you believe in, right? Like Jesus died for our sins. It is the sacredness that Durkheim is talking about. Functional is based on what you do or what you perform. Like we should go to mass. It doesn't matter if you believe that mass is something that you do to get into heaven. What matters is you perform something. On the other hand, let's talk about communitarian or sociological versus individual or psychological. On one hand, communitarianism is like something is a religion if there's a community that believes and practices that religion. On the other hand, if we're talking about individualism, it's a religion, even if the belief or practice is held or done by just one person. So here's a table that sort of shows this. And then I tweak the definition given by Durkheim to show like the different combinations. If it is substantial communitarian, basically religion for you is a system of beliefs related to the sacred held by community. This is a traditional definition of Durkheim. But if you're talking about substantial individualistic, what you're saying is it is a system of beliefs related to the sacred that can be held by just an individual. If you are functional communitarian, if that's your definition, you are saying that it's a system of beliefs performing the function of the sacred, but it's held by a community. On the other hand, if it's functional individualistic, it's a system of beliefs performing the sacred held by an individual. So, as examples, if it is substantial communitarian, that's organized religion, baby. If it's substantial individualistic, this is your personal relationship with God. If it's functional communitarian, this would be an implicit religion. But lastly, if it is a functional individualistic, this would be any moral belief that is equivalent to a supernatural belief. That would be considered a religion. So depending on what part of the spectrum or what part of the Cartesian plane you're on, you will be able to find examples and exceptions to whatever definition you have. So if it's individualistic substantial, the implication there is you can believe whatever you want that's related to the sacred, right? You are a personal, you have a personal belief or a personal relationship with God. But this only means that this speech or this belief is protected under freedom of religion if it is related to the supernatural or related to the sacred. If you are an atheist, this would not fall under freedom of religion, but freedom of speech. So this is the position of Father Bernas, the late Father Bernas, who is one of the framers of our present constitution. That if you're an atheist, your speech doesn't fall under freedom of religion, but under freedom of speech. But if you are an individualistic functional, that's your definition of religion, the state would protect any philosophy that's important to you as long as it's as important to an individual as a religion is to a believer. So again, individualistic functional, this would be any moral belief equivalent to supernatural belief. And this would mean that if you are a secular humanist and you are drafted to go to war, usually you can do conscientious objection. You can say, I don't want to serve in the army because my religion prevents me from killing. But there was a case, US versus Seeger, where the person claimed a conscientious objection, saying that as a secular humanist, they also do not believe in killing. And in this case, the Supreme Court of the United States said that, yeah, fine. It's okay. We are granting your conscientious objection. So if this is your definition of religion, even secular humanism, even atheism, even being an agnostic would be considered part of freedom of religion and would have all of the protections and limitations associated with it. So some of these protections are tax exemptions. So if a church and the land upon which the church is built is used only and exclusively for religious purposes, that's tax exempt. So if the definition that we're adopting is individualistic functional, then we would extend that to land that is exclusively used by atheists or agnostics or secular humanists, right? If your definition is communitarian substantial, it's about organized religions, especially minority religions. That's what we're protecting. If it's communitarian functional, it's about groups of people that act like a religion, even if they don't believe in the secret. So this would also have implications on whether Pastafarians are considered a religion, whether they should protect. Another example of a parody religion is the invisible pink unicorn. If you are a member of the Church of the Invisible Pink Unicorn, what you're basically saying is we're performing a lot of the things that ordinary religions do under a communitarian substantial framework, but we don't really believe in it. The reason why it's invisible pink unicorn is because it highlights the contradictions that you usually find in religion where we know what God is, but we can't see or perceive them. In the same way that Even though this unicorn is invisible, we still know that it's pink, right? So that's just a fun fact for you. But anyway, you can apply this to different religions, right? If you're on gold for this house believes that the freedom of religion includes the freedom to offend religion, what you can say is the definition that we're using is individual functional because opposition to religion takes the place of religious beliefs. Opposition to religion occupies the same level of importance, right? It's functionally also an opinion on the divine. If the motion is this house opposes organized religion, the definition that you can use is communitarian or subcommunitarian substantive or sociological substantive, where you say that organized religion implies the existence of a community. The community is based on actual beliefs of the divine. On the third one, I had already talked about this, recognize the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, communitarian functional. Parody religions are organized religions in name only. They have all of the practices of an organized religion, but they don't believe in a sacred. And lastly, for this house believes that states should stop identifying citizens based on their religion. When you're defining this, what is their religion? We can use individual substantive. We want to say that religion varies per person so much it becomes useless as a means of identification, right? So you can't, on one level, right, on a principle level, you shouldn't be able to discriminate on the basis of religion. But on the second level, even if it's a valuable distinction, we would argue that religion varies per person, so much so that it becomes useless as a means of identification. So even if it was principally valid, it's still useless, right? So the variety of religious identities makes the statistic absolutely reductionist. And it's always bad statistics. You can argue those two things, right? Okay, next part. Let's talk about religion in itself. And here we're going to be talking about the political science of religion. We're going to be talking about a few things. We're going to be talking about religions as micro political systems. We're going to be talking about means of legitimation. We're going to talk about who decides what is taught and how it's taught. And lastly, why does politics matter? Does that make sense? Why do politics matter? Grammar, right? Why does all of this matter with regard to religion? So first, I want to talk about the approach that we're going to take. We're going to be treating it as a clear box. So in computer science, testing a program can be done using either a black box testing or clear box testing. In black box testing, the tester, so this can be, you don't know anything about the code of the program. So you're not aware about its internal structure or anything. We're checking if it works all together. So our focus would be what you input and what is the system output. And you're going to ignore the internal knowledge of the code. This is what game developers do when they get beta testers. They don't get the beta testers to study the code. They just test the game and see if there are any bugs, right? So they don't know knowledge about the code of the program. They're checking their inputs and the outputs. In clear box testing, the tester is able to see the code. So we're looking at the stability of the code. Is it efficient? Does it use too much like computing power, stuff like that? The reason why, for example, Yandere simulator that really exposes you, right? The reason why Yandere simulate is often very laggy, it's because the code itself is very inefficient. So we're looking at the stability of the code. Usually it's used for checking within the code whether or not the code is secure. So for this section, we're going to use a clear box approach to understand the code of religion, the internal structure of religions as micro political systems. Yeah, they're micro political systems because there are different actors vying for influence within the religious organization. But another thing that I want to note is it doesn't matter if you're like in a STEM field or like in computer science, you can use the approaches that you learned there and apply it to different themes in debate, like what I did with this black box versus clear box. I'm not even a computer science major. Like it's just something that I took an interest in one day and then I decided to apply it to religion. You can do this for any theory, any like framework, any method, and then apply it to any theme in debate. So next, let's talk about legitimation. Legitimation is the process by which a leader gets legitimacy. Legitimacy is whether or not your claim to obedience is valid. So the essence here is people should feel morally compelled to follow, not coerced. So if you have a legitimate leader in a democratic society, what it means is that the will of the people chose them. So they want to follow this leader, not because they're going to kill you, if you don't follow, but because you actually chose or believed in that leader. So there are different things that we call legitimation transmitters that communicate the claim to obedience. So you have things like legitimation formulas, which are ideologies that justify unequal distribution of power, because basically the power that you have in your organization is going to be concentrated in the leader or leaders, right? And the legitimation formula is the ideology that justifies that concentration. There are also political rituals that act as an apparatus for the formula. So this can be an election, this can be the taking of the oath in politics. In Catholicism, this would be the Cardinal of Bishop, sorry, the College of Cardinals, and however they pick the Pope, it's all of the rituals that are for that, right? Succession is also a process by which one leader is replaced by the next, and those changes must be validated according to the formula, according to the ideology, right? Lastly, legitimation transmitters include the actions themselves of a ruler, because it's possible that they were legitimate at first. So if you were democratically elected or you were known as like a very reliable person to succeed as pope, and then later, because of your actions, you alienated a lot of people and you became less legitimate as a leader. This is also very possible. We're going to be talking about all of these. So, why is this important? It's important because every use of power has two components. One is force, and the second is recognition of the validity of yeah, the recognition of the ruler's validity, right? So it's coercion and legitimacy. If you don't have coercion or you don't have legitimacy, nothing will happen, right? If you don't have either of these, people will not follow you. Why would you do that? Especially if it's not like a rational thing to do. Why would I give money to the church if I don't believe I will go to hell or if I don't believe that the church is trustworthy with my money? Right? So the coercive power here is I will go to hell if I don't follow the leader, if I don't follow the church. The legitimacy aspect here is I believe that the church will do something good, or I believe that the church deserves this money. Coercion and legitimacy. If you don't have either of these, nothing will happen. But each religion and each political system has different combinations of coercion and legitimacy. So the extremes are like in tyranny, it's not legitimate at all. People do not believe in the validity of the system, but they have force. They are able to use state forces, or let's call it the Inquisition, to prevent you from doing anything else, believing in anything else, or going generally against the wishes of the tyrant. Or you can have compliance based on pure respect. Like, even if I'm not going to sanction you, it's you just believe it's your personal moral obligation to follow. So this is based on honor. This is based on you earned my respect, stuff like that. So if you have more legitimacy, there's less need to use coercion. The opposite is true. If you do not have legitimacy, in order to get people in line, you need to use coercion more. So it's more useful to have more legitimacy because there are costs to acts of power. If you're going to use coercion, that's very costly, right? Just the idea of enforcing whatever you want to happen is already very costly for any organization. So if you're very legitimate, there's less need for force, less cost for acts of power. But also, legitimacy and goal attainment is a positive feedback. So if the leader is legitimate and you follow them, and because you follow them, you get a goal, that increases the legitimacy of the leader. So it's a positive feedback. Like more legitimacy leads to more obedience leads to more goal attainment leads to more legitimacy, and so on and so forth. Right? So at some point, very legitimate and very efficient organizations stop questioning, like, yeah, we should just follow because they've never led us astray before. And you can see that not just in religion, but also in any other political system, right? So legitimation is, I believe, what makes politics what it is. So the reason why we have legitimation formulas and justifications at all is because, hold on, because social psychologists show that people crave justification, and providing reasons for a request dramatically increases the chances that the request will be granted. And this is true even if the reasons upon a second or third glance don't really make. So, for example, if you say something like, I want you to do this because God wants you to do this, just saying that God wants you to do this makes it more likely that they will do it. So this isn't like a 100% chance, but the difference between not having that reason and having that reason, that's already dramatic. So there's political potential that resides in your ability to justify your use or your concentration of political power. So there are many possible reasons that you can think of for why a ruler gives a particular justification. On a cynical level, you can say that we're giving you this justification not because we believe in it, but because we know that if you give this reason, people are likely to follow. A more optimistic view of it is that they genuinely believe in it. But the gray area or the middle ground is whatever. They may or may not believe at first, but their desire to be consistent forces them to act like they believe in it. So rulers, their behavior might converge with their actual principle. Because if you say one thing and do another, that lessens your legitimacy. So you want to be consistent, right? So when you say something, follow through on it. And eventually, even if the ruler does not actually believe in it, the desire to be consistent in order to retain legitimacy makes it as if they actually believe in it. So there are lots of people in the right wing that don't really believe in the things that they're saying. The same way that there are lots of people on the left wing that don't really believe what they're saying. Or rather, what they're saying is different from what they're saying is different from what they're doing or what they believe in. But because if people find out the hypocrisy or the hypocrisy blows up, so you do expose a lot of hypocrisy, but they generally want to seem more consistent or yeah, that's the reason why you want to point out hypocrisy, right? Because if someone is being hypocritical, then it lessens their legitimacy in the eye of moderate. Although you can say about the right wing is even if you point out that they're hypocritical, they're like very strong base, they just don't care. But most debates are not about people on the far ends of the political spectrum who will believe in it no matter what. It's about those people in the middle where, depending on consistency, they might sway. Although you can also say, Nina might also say this, that with the trend in polarization, there are less and less moderates. You could say something like that. Okay, next, let's talk about a theocracy. And we're going to talk about it to apply these frameworks. So the legitimation formula is theocracy. That's the source of legitimacy. It's God, right? And theocracy is different from dictatorship because theocracy talks about where do you get your legitimacy, but dictatorship refers to how much power do you have. So it can be a theocracy in the sense that the leaders were chosen by God, but it doesn't necessarily mean that those leaders can do whatever they want, right? So a theocracy can say, whoever we vote, that is the will of God. But that does not mean that they can do whatever they want because ultimately it's supposed to be what the people want. Vox populi, vox dei, right? So just because something is a theocracy doesn't necessarily mean it's a dictatorship. There are three aspects involved in political systems. So If there are, yeah. So you can have at least 30 different kinds of political systems because you have, on one hand, you have procedure of succession, and there's democracy and autocracy. There's comprehensiveness of power, liberal, authoritarian, or totalitarian. And there's a source of legitimacy, which is can be religion, can be tradition, can be knowledge, it can be popular will, or it can be nothing. So there are five. So if you multiply those five sources with those three kinds of comprehensiveness of power and systems and those two kinds of procedure of succession, you get 30 kinds of different political systems. You can just mix and match these different factors to think of something else. And while most Western political systems are contractual, meaning it's about popular will, yeah, contractual liberal democracies, that is to say, the procedure of succession is a democracy. The comprehensiveness of power, it's liberal. They have less power, and their source of legitimacy is a popular will. Most Western political systems are like that. But some non-Western democracies are non-liberal, non-contractual, or both. So an example of this is ancient Athens. Ancient Athenian democracy was contractual because they looked at popular will, but it was authoritarian because if you voted for someone, that leader would have more comprehensive powers compared to like modern day president. The European Union is in principle democratic, but arguably you can say that their source of legitimacy is more meritocratic than contractual. That is to say, who gets to decide the thing is based on their merit or their knowledge rather than whether everyone in the European Union likes it, right? Since its justification is more often than not, its technocratic effectiveness rather than fulfilling the will of the different member states of the European Union. And with regard to religion, 17th century Puritan colonies of New England had a succession procedure that was decidedly democratic. The governor was elected by all men, men, I want to emphasize men, all free men of the colony in New England, Puritan colonies in New England. So it was a democracy, but the democracy was not contractual. That is to say, even though we are choosing leaders based on democracy, the source of legitimacy is really gone. It's really a theocracy, right? Because it would occur to nobody that the governor's power comes from the people in the sense of being the popular expression of sovereignty. His power came from God, who just used the electorate, just used the voters as instruments for revealing his choice. So just because you're a democracy doesn't necessarily mean that your source of legitimacy is contractual. It can be something else, right? So another example is I think Miriam Defensor Santiago wanted only the most qualified people to be able to run for office. So the procedure of succession would be a democracy, but the source of legitimacy would not be this is like our popular will kasi. The source of their legitimacy would be their knowledge, their merit, right? Or yeah, something like that. And for this reason, we also see that the divine origin lies on a spectrum. So there are many different ways to look at it. There's divine rule, there's deification of rulers, there's God anointment, and there are priests. Let's talk about each one of these individuals. So when we're talking about direct rule, what they mean here is that God is directly controlling or directly leading the people. So in ancient Israel, Abraham was the leader, but he didn't make the decisions. He's just a mouthpiece of God. He gets the commands of God and he says it to people. And the Bible verse here is, and you will realize what an evil thing you did in the eyes of the Lord when you asked for a king. And that's because when the Israelites appointed a king, it was seen in the Bible as a grave error because it severed the bond, the covenant between God and Israel, right? So you need to have a particular leader as a mouthpiece of God. And if you don't believe in that mouthpiece, that is a violation of the religious principles or whatever. Another example is Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. You can call them LDS, although the president says that's what Satan wants. But you might know them as Mormons, right? They have a church president. In this case, it's Russell Nelson Sr., to whom the Heavenly Father directly communicates with. Yeah. Sorry, with whom the Heavenly Father directly communicates. And for more information, go watch Book of Mormon. It's one of my favorite musicals, but it's very eventful. This is all my favorites. Another way to do it is deification of rulers. So this would be like you weren't chosen by God. You are not God's mouthpiece. You are literally a God. So in ancient Egypt, Pharaoh is an incarnation or reincarnation of Horus. In Greco-Roman societies, Alexander the Great and Roman rulers and Caesar, they were considered gods because that universalized claim over other territories. Because if they weren't gods, they would have just been a tyrant, right? Because they were very authoritarian or maybe even totalitarian. So they were like, we're rational people, we're a democracy, right? So we think that we're actually gods. We're not just mean. In Japan, the emperors were descended from the sun god Amaterasu. If you remember your social studies or Araling Panglipunan class from second year high school or from high school in general, you might know that the Chinese emperors had a mandate of heaven, but more than that, they were sons of heaven. Because what I was taught was they have a mandate of heaven, they were chosen by God. But they weren't just that, they were sons of heaven. They are God-like. So if they weren't gods, they're at least partly God or descended from gods. And deification is possible where the religious system has rulers that it's possible where the religious system the rulers use to justify their claims is based on political power. So if the ruler used political power to justify their claims, it's possible to deify yourself, right? Yeah. So it's the political power that creates the religious system. So they conquered because they were deities, and it's not like they're deities because they conquered, right? Yeah. Another thing is the White Man's Burden. It's the poem that was made by Rudyard Kipling, who also wrote the Jungle Book. And it says, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil, half child." Half devil, half child. They're talking about us. They're talking about Filipinos. They're talking about people of color. They're talking about Asians. They're talking about Africans. It was because the US and Europe were so rich that they felt they had the divine right and obligation to colonize and civilize other parts of the world. In essence, the US and Great Britain deified themselves as great civilizers. And the only justification for added use of power is that those uses of power were successful before. Therefore, they have the divine right. They're not devils unlike the Filipinos, but they're chosen to lead because they are themselves sacred. They are themselves divine. So it's the same thing that you would see from it's the same thing that you would see from Alexander the Great, right? The reason why they are so rich, they're so powerful, is because they're God. And if they weren't, how else would they have been able to get so rich? So that's why the political power came first, and the political power justified their deification. Next, let's talk about God's anointment. So it's possible that you are not God, but you're close to God. You're mimesis. So in the Roman Empire, you had god kings, starting with Romulus, who was the founder of Rome. He was renamed Quirinus, which means the undefeated God. And this continued until Constantine, who turned to Christianity. And as an effect of Christianization, you can no longer call yourself God, right? So Romulus said he is God. But when turned to Christianity, Constantine was like, oh, I can't be considered God anymore because under my religion, there's only one God. So the deification of the emperor could no longer be done, which is why they were just anointed by God. They are close to, but they don't directly speak for God. They are not directly God. So it's a compromise. The emperor is not a god in Islam, but just a reflection. It's a mimicry of God. In medieval Europe, the ruler was subordinate to the pope, the one who is anointed. This form of anointment limited the church just claim to power. The West, even though a lot of its history was based on theocracy, it never went so far as to deify the Pope is not God, right? And as a result of the church's close relationship with the state, the papacy could never get 100% control over itself. Because the Pope, again, he's not God. He is not completely infallible, right? He's just a mimicry. He's just close to God. But we can say that maybe our wisdom might be better. Not better than God's, but better than yours, right? Because you're a pale imitation of what God is. So, papal supremacy, this is based on Matthew chapter 16, verse 17, where Jesus says, "Upon this rock," touched Peter, "upon this rock, I will build my church. I give to you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you hold true on earth, I will hold true in heaven." So papal supremacy, which is based on the Bible, but became accepted because actually the reason why people really like the Pope is because the Pope used to travel all across the land and resolving conflicts between different interpretations of scripture. Everyone was like, damn, the Pope is really good at telling us what God wants. And they're like ontological arguments, usually in the different councils, starting with the Council of Nicaea. But since the Pope is so freaking good at telling us what God wants to resolve our conflicts, we think he should tell us who the king is and what the king should do. And the reason why, in the slide, it's a keyblade, is the keyblade is the coat of arms of the Vatican. And if you take a look at these two keyblades, it really looks like in Kingdom Hearts, Oathkeeper and Oblivion. Oathkeeper, as in Peter's promise to Jesus, Oblivion, as in that's what Jesus saved us from, and also Roxas, who is Sora's nobody. Roxas is the only one who can use Oathkeeper and Oblivion at the same time. So Roxas is technically the Pope, but Roxas, according to Kingdom Hearts lore, is also Sora's nobody, and Sora is the bearer of the Heart of Ventus. That sounds like a holy trinity to me. You have Roxas, you have Sora, and you have the Heart of Ventus. That's Father, Son, Holy Spirit, maybe. Yeah, but I think I've made like easier. Like it's perfect logic. But anyway, lastly, priests sharing power with another who is anointed. This is also, I want to talk about the investiture controversy here. How the church at some point fought for secularism. So in the 10th, 11th century, Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII had a controversy over who could appoint bishops or invest bishops. Before, it was a secular authority. It was the king. But that was a problem because the Holy Roman Emperor was the one who appointed bishops and who appointed the next pope, who appoints the next emperor, and there was no balance of power. So there were some reformists, Gregorian reformists, who took advantage of the fact that King Henry was just a baby boy and demanded from the Pope that bishops would never again be invested by a secular authority. Instead, it should be the College of Cardinals. And the reason for that, again, it's simple, right? Because if the emperor, a secular power, appoints the bishop, who appoints the Pope, who appoints the next emperor, the emperor essentially can choose people who are close to him, who he can influence to pick whichever emperor he wants next. There's no balance of power here. So Gregorian reformists were like, we need to establish a balance of power so that the Pope and the emperor, then the emperor will not be able to influence who the Pope is, and the Pope will not be able to influence the next emperor. Yeah. So that's why we have the College of Cardinals. That's why Pope Francis was chosen with the white smoke and stuff. So Pope Gregory VII said, you know what? You're right as train. Regarding reformists, you're completely right. By that time, Henry IV was no longer a baby boy. So he said, no, I ain't going. Henry IV was not a baby boy anymore. So he said, no, I ain't going no more. Gregory VII, because this is, again, a theocracy, excommunicated Henry IV and deposed him as emperor. And neither declaration was enforceable because neither power, neither the king nor the pope recognized each other's power. But the nobles of Germany said, hey, we can get money out of this. Like, that's why you got the Great Saxon Revolt. They were replaced by King Rudolph, but Henry IV murdered Rudolph 10 years later. The Pope asked help from Vikings to protect himself, but the Vikings pillaged Rome, so the Pope became unpopular, so the Pope left until 1122, the Concordat of Worms. Secular leaders couldn't choose, but had an unofficial say in the appointment of officials. So, while this didn't end the conflict, it weakened the legitimacy of the this led to the formalization college cardinals and also set the stage for the Crusades. But it also set the stage for the separation of church and state and the weakening of oppressive monarchies. Yeah, it goes that deep. We're talking about secularism. That's a perfect segue to the next part, which is about religion and the state. So here we're going to be talking about church-state paradigms. We're going to be talking about religious freedoms, and we're going to be talking about religious acceptance. And I did talk about this in Debatable, which is my podcast before Outspoken 101. But there are some parts here that I think you can only communicate through a PowerPoint or a lecture like this. So here's a summary, a not podcast friendly summary of church state paradigms. A CS paradigm or church state paradigm focuses on institutional relationships between state and religion. So, is there an official state religion? Are churches formally linked to the state? Do religions hold positions in government? What is the level of state support? All of these are poured into a church state paradigm. So the main question here is, how much does the law limit religion? So you have dictatorial and democratic forms of paradigms and close and separated forms. So close means that basically you're just very close with the church. And doesn't necessarily mean that the church can influence or dictate, but yeah, you're very close. The other hand is completely separated, where you can never meet. They can never make policies that affect the other. On the other hand, says dictatorial means that the church will be able to dictate what happens in the religion, or the religion will be able to dictate what happens in the society. Right. The other hand, democratic states we're still going to vote, right? So if it's very close, if church and state are very close, but it remains a democracy, most likely they're just going to have an established church. And if you are not in that church, if you're not in that church, that's fine. You just have an official state religion. We're very close like that, but you can do whatever you want. And then going down from there, democratic, but you're not super close, not super separated. Probably you just have an endorsed church. Like it's not our official religion or anything, but we reference it a lot in the Constitution. So maybe you can argue that the Philippines has an endorsed church because we have so help me God in a lot of our political rituals. And if it's completely separated and still democratic, you have a complete separation of church and state. If it's very close, you can say it's a monist. Monist. That is to say, there's only one system. There's no difference between the church and state. If it's completely separated, it's dualism. They're completely separated. But let's say it's very dictatorial. If they're super close, right? There's no difference between church and state. If they're dictatorial, that means there's theocratic absolutism. This is where you get, oh, you're not part of our religion, we're gonna punish you. The other hand, secular absolutism is the complete opposite. Oh, you believe in a church, you believe in religion, we're gonna punish. Okay. So the separation of church and state is the foundation for many liberal democracies. So you have freedom of religion. Here we call that the free exercise clause. I think that's Article 3, Section 5, I think. No, Section 5. Basta Article 3 yan, Bill of Rights in our Constitution. Right? Bill of Rights. That's the free exercise. So you can freely exercise your religion unless there's a compelling state interest that says bawal. Next is freedom from state religion. So if the state establishes an official state religion, that'll be a violation. So that way yun. free exercise clause, and the non-establishment. So you can't establish a state religion. So that's the foundation for many liberal democracies. But there's a spectrum here also, because on one hand, you have strict separationism, which is the Jeffersonian view of what a secular democracy would be, which is let's not do anything with each other. They're supposed to be completely separate. On the other hand, in the middle, you have neutrality, where, okay, you can probably make policies that affect each other, but then no excessive intertwining, no excessive entanglement with religion. And lastly, you have accommodation. That's what we have in the Philippines, where it's okay for us to have government policies that benefit religion, but only so that we can accommodate people's religious beliefs. So the reason why there might be a law about a national Bible day, or there might be a law that says certain days in the Ramadan are holidays, that's because the state is creating a law that affects religion, but only so that people's free exercise of religion can be accommodated. Yun lang yan. We just need to accommodate. So you can actually argue now there's an excessive entanglement between church and state here, but that's not the point. The point is it's okay for them to be entangled as long as it can empower people to use their religious beliefs. The exception here is the compelling state interest. Yes. That is to say, if there's a compelling state interest and the policy is narrowly tailored such that there is no less intrusive way of obtaining that interest or fulfilling that interest, then you can limit religion. And this is true even in the Philippines, where we want to accommodate religious exercises as much as we want. Like, not just as much as you want, as much as we can. So usually, let's say you're trying to, if the state wants people to be patriotic, and some people, let's say Jehovah's Witnesses, say, no, I don't want to participate in a flag ceremony that tries to make me more patriotic, because patriotism essentially means that I am not believing in God as the foremost authority in my life. There have been some cases where people got into trouble because of that. Maybe they were expelled, but the Supreme Court ended up saying that, okay, fine, patriotism, that might be compelling state interest, but there are alternatives to get patriotism that don't require punishing people for just exercising their religion, right? And because of that, it's better that we accommodate. So the benevolent accommodation doctrine basically says that for any law, that is neutral on its face, that neutral meaning it can apply to any religion. If there are some people who are like, I have a religious belief that conflicts with this, can I have an exemption? The state generally has to give that exemption unless there's a compelling state interest and there is no other way to get that interest rather than limiting their ability to freely exercise their religion. So the problem with the church state paradigms, it's good because you can see like structural reasons why something happens. You see a structural reason why a religion is more likely to block vote in one place and less likely to block vote in another place, right? But if you just focus on the law, that can really blind you, because what is in law is rarely reflected in reality. The law doesn't consider informal, non-institutional channels exerting political pressure on believers. So Boston, after the Boston Tea Party, they were legally democratic, but they were really theocratic in terms of their legitimation formula. The Philippines today, constitutionally, we're secular. But what about powerful grassroots mobilization of, let's say, the INC or the CBCP, right? Which means it's not enough to look at CS paradigms. We also need to take a look at the community that exists within our religion as the next part of the lecture. Here, what we want to talk about is how does religion inspire political action? Should they even participate in politics? When do we say that it's effective? So this last one, this is the economic model of religion that I've been exploring. So first, let's talk about how does religion inspire political action? And here we need to note that religious activity has three features, very common features. One is there is a communal experience of belonging. Belonging. Second, there's an intellectual experience of learning from authority. And thirdly, there's a moral experience serving as a source of imperatives. Let's call them like principles, moral principles. So tatlo, belonging, authority, principles. So each feature systematically creates dispositions among believers, which in turn forms attitudes that are common to them. Of course, we can't generalize that we can't say that everyone has it. What we can say is that structurally speaking, these features make it structurally more likely for some people to have certain attitudes. So belongingness, if you belong to a community, in order for that community to thrive, it needs a common identity. And that common identity ends up creating conformity or a pressure to conform. On the other hand, authority means that if you listen to an authority, it's an intellectual experience of listening to an authority. You end up getting a homogenous or almost homogenous worldview as you just keep listening to the authority or like the magisterium or the pope. And the attitude there is if you stray from that, you're not following the religion properly. So if you want to be a good believer, you need to be disciplined and following authority. And lastly, principles. Principles create a shared code of ethics, and a shared code of ethics becomes the foundations of moral obligation. So there are three attitudes: conformity, discipline, and moral obligation. And those three feed into each other and create political mobilization. So there, and mobilization can be conventional, which is to say like voting, lobbying, class suits, etc. Like using the different aspects of government, the different branches of government. So if you're voting for legislators. If you're lobbying legislators and executives, lobbying is you're asking your elected officials to do something, and class suits is you're using um the judicial channels, right? So the legal channels in the courts in order to get what you want. It can also be unconventional, which is to say protests. And whether those protests are legal or illegal doesn't matter. What matters is it's mobilization. It can also be peaceful, it can also be violent, right? So why is this important for debaters? If we're talking about different motions, you can look at either the upper half of this sort of authority, discipline, moral obligation to get your arguments, or the lower half, conventional, unconventional to get your arguments. So let's think about this house would give benefits to religions in exchange for non-participation in politics. I think this was a grand finals motion like 10 years ago. And this house believes that the government should disallow religious leaders from publicly endorsing, supporting, or commenting on any political party or candidate. So you can have a three-step process. One is what part of the framework, this framework, is it related to? Second, what kinds of actions are affected? And third, are the effects good or bad? So for the first motion, let's talk about the upper half first. What part of the framework is it related? If this happens, you can see that we can no longer use conformity or discipline to make people vote. So we're using the upper half, conformity and discipline. So presumably, there's still going to be a moral obligation. But without the authority telling you to vote and the community telling you, we will disown you if you don't vote in this way, how is it likely that mobilization will happen? On the other hand, if there's a barrier to mobilization, there's a trade off where people really want to mobilize, but they have to ask whether or not the three aspects of religion, again, belonging, morality, or authority, could be better utilized if they have the benefits. That's for the first thought, for the first motion, right? Because that's the trade off. You have less mobilization because you don't have conformity, you don't have authority, but you have more benefits. And those benefits can let you better utilize belonging, morality, and authority in other ways, right? So that's the trade off. So on the third part of the framework, you can say, you can insert arguments about, oh, it's good because something RH bill or RH law, it's bad because something is just like any other political organization now, and we shouldn't silence that. That's pragmatic, right? And then you can do the same framework, the same three questions for the second motion. That's pragmatic. But what about principle? Should we create a barrier to mobilization? So here's where we can talk about, is it really just like any other political organization? So this is quite debatable. right? This is the core of many of these religion debates. So, question here, is it the same or different from other political actors? Do you treat it as sui generis, which is like in a category all on its own, or is it just like any other belief system? Because you can look at examples like avid Euro Catholics, where you just pick and choose what part of the religion you want to get, or block voting, where you are like just like Democrats or Republicans who want to vote for your particular candidate. And all three of those attitudes, again, conformity, discipline, moral obligation, you can find it to some extent in any movement. But to what extent do they exist? Another question is, how strong are these attitudes? So, to what extent can a member of the Democratic Party defy the norm? And compare it to what extent can a member of a church defy the norm? And why is that the case is obviously the next question. And here, matter helps. Usually, though, if you don't have matter, you can just say, oh, you can't rebut God, or it's hard to leave the church, or there are liberal readings of scriptures, there's a tendency to form sects. Even if you don't have matter, usually this is compelling. People just believe this for the vibes. But like the process by which those are created, the pressures that are there that make it hard to leave the church, the pressures that are there to like not rebut God or pressures that encourage the liberal readings of scriptures, stuff like that, those can definitely help in higher level debates. Another thing you can say is it's just like other interest groups. This is maraming iba't ibang parts though. Like the next few slides are about this argument. So you can argue that it's just like any other interest. The first premise here is when you're saying interest, it means not necessarily a material interest. You can have all kinds of motives of individual and collective behavior, including non material goods, that is based on ideology. So, by this standard, believing that there is a moral imperative post abortion is enough of a justification for religious actors to mobilize. It's a legitimate interest. And trying to establish moral norms is also a valid justification. So, you can also say that political participation of interest groups is valued in democracy. That's the first premise. The second premise is interest involves not only material considerations, but also ideological ones, which is why rights based thinkers in politics don't deal in consequentialism. They don't go like, it's your right, even if it might harm others, or it's your right, even if it's inconvenient to others, or inconvenient to the state. It's your right. It's outside the bounds of what we can consider in politics. And those kinds of people exist, and it's valid and it's secular. Third premise, believing that it's immoral to do something is an ideological position, even if the ideology comes from religion. So, for example, in EDSA, there was a unity between the church and civilian movements against the dictator. Next is religious groups are therefore functionally equivalent to any other interest group or any other political party. They should therefore be included in the political process. You should not create barriers to their mobilization. Okay, so this is how I would argue, like to a 5-year-old, why the church should be participate in religion. But there's a problem with this. And the problem is religious action, you can argue, is irrational and therefore different from what you would see from Democrats or Republicans. The political participation of interest groups is valued in democracy. And it is true that interest involves not only material considerations, but also theological ones. But what we disagree with is the idea that religious groups are functionally equivalent to any other religious group. Why is this? You would argue that religious ideology is fundamentally different from what you would find in other religious groups because religious organizations anchor their activity in the supernatural and therefore their claims are irrational, non negotiable, and impossible to rebut. So if you're a Catholic, it's impossible to rebut because God says so. So it's unlike ordinary political organizations. And even if you are a Catholic, it's very difficult to overcome conformity, discipline, and moral obligation attitudes in religion, even if you might have liberal readings of scripture, right? So as a Catholic, I have liberal readings of scripture, but it's very difficult to overcome conformity, discipline, and moral obligation attitudes of other members of my religion. And they go, yeah, but the CBCP doesn't think this way. Why should I believe you over them? I am obliged to conform to whatever they say, and I'm not obliged to conform to what you say. Right. So even if you are a Catholic, it's very difficult to overcome that conformity. So if you're not Catholic, you can't say that, no, that's not what God wants. Because who knows what God wants? But second, even if you are a Catholic and you read the Bible to guess what God wants, then it means that be liberal, be progressive. It's difficult to overcome if the authority says that's not what it's supposed to be. So the mobilization of religious groups is far more robust compared to any other interest group as a result of the irrationality. Why? Because if you don't do it, you will go to hell. So mobilization here is super scary. You cannot define it, right? So here are the different claims that you want to look at. First is religious organizations anchor their activity in supernatural and are often irrational, non-negotiable, impossible to rebut. Second is mobilization of religious groups, far more robust. So let's rebut the second one first. Let's expound on the second one first. Mobilization of religious groups is far more robust. First, the consequences of nonconformity involve spending an eternity in hell. So there's an overwhelming incentive to mobilize. But secondly, belonging is not enough for salvation. More is always better than less. So just because you've been going to mass your entire life doesn't necessarily mean you will go to heaven. You need to do all you can to increase your chances of going to heaven. More is always better than less. So you have an incentive not just to block vote, but also to do everything else that might be asked of you, right? It's not enough for you to vote for someone who doesn't like abortion. What you should be doing is not vote for that person and also campaign for other people that your religion agrees with, right? So those two things. And how about this next one? Their claims are often irrational, non-negotiable, and impossible to rebut. This is super debatable to me. So what you can say to demonstrate this is to rebut this is that religious claims are not irrational. And second, even if they are irrational, it is no different from the irrationality that you would find in other ideologies. So, dalawa yan. They're not irrational. And even if they are irrational, everything else should be considered irrational. This is not intuitive. That's why I needed to lecture this. So, how do you prove that religious claims are not irrational? You can see most religious claims are backed either by common sense or solid philosophical foundations. So, scholasticism, the Summa Theologica by Thomas Aquinas, that's very rational. If you read it, super like systematic, very rational. And there are lots of medieval philosophers also that looked at rationality. But also, you have religious claims that can be challenged with religion. So, one of the books that I have at home is What Paul Really Said About Women. Is one of the, Paul is the one who wrote a lot of letters. And Paul is the one who said really misogynist things like the courage of a man is in leading, the courage of women is in following. So, yeah, like gender roles talaga. But what I think it's Pastor Bristol who wrote What Paul Really Said About Women. I read it years and years ago. What he said was this was a mistranslation. Really, what he was trying to say was that like we are different in terms of what we can do, but we are equal in terms of how valuable we are to God. And that's the reason why Paul also wrote something like, in Jesus, there's no such thing as man, there's no such thing as woman, it's all just humanity. So what Paul really said about women, you can challenge those religious claims with other religious readings. There's also Islamic feminism. And you can look it up on Wikipedia. It's very enlightening. But secondly, the idea that religious claims, even if they are irrational, we should also consider other ideological positions to be irrational. So there are three reasons why you can see this. One is debates about morality are always interminable. That's the evidence for this. You can never end a debate about utilitarianism versus deontology, or at some point, you will just repeat yourself. Okay? You will eventually just agree to disagree. What also ends up happening is there was a motion before about the trolley problem, like literally just a trolley problem. That was a motion. People had a hard time making arguments for it because, like, how do you rebut this? How do you make an argument for this? Stuff like that. It's always interminable. For hundreds of years, you've been debating the same thing and you've never found a resolution. And the reason for that is at the end of the day, whether you are a utilitarian, or whether you are the deontologist, it's based on your personal preference, your subjective like feelings. So this is also called emotivism. My main source for this is Alasdair MacIntyre's Beyond Virtue. Okay, your ultimate idea of morality, what you subscribe to, is based on your subjective preferences, not because of rationality. The same thing for being for welfare or not being for welfare. At the end of the day, like you can find evidence for both sides of the spectrum, and you can just agree to disagree. It's because you can't really find anything else other than tigap mo eh, tigap niya eh. Yeah, this one. It's just as irrational. It's just as subjective. But secondly, laws, insofar as they represent one ideology over another, are impositions of arbitrary values that cannot be rebutted. You can't rebut, okay, if the law is supposed to say that we need to protect laborers, you cannot really, if you break that law, you can say, well, that law is silly anyway. It's dura lex sed lex, right? Harsh law is still law. So you can't rebut it, especially if it's based on arbitrary values and emotivism. There's no difference, therefore, between canon law, the canons of ethics, and laws in general with respect to how rational each canon is. When I wrote a paper about this in law school, I don't necessarily subscribe to this, but it's an interesting argument to explore, right? But lastly, you might say, oh, how about science? How about evidence? But science is not super objective either. So there's this thing called the theory ladenness of observation. Ben Shapiro said that facts don't care about your theories, but what facts you observe and how you see those facts is dependent on your. So can you imagine like one of those item finder games? There's a photo of a bunch of stuff. And it's very difficult at first glance to see, oh, this is a violin, this is a piece of string, stuff like that. But if you get a list of things that you need to look for, it's easier to find those things. And it's the same thing with science, right? It's the same thing. Because if you have a theory first, it informs the things that you see. It informs the things that you can observe. There's something that we found in the philosophy of science and in the history of science. More than that, according to historian of science Thomas, what he says is, in order for science to develop as a field, we need to have dogma. We need to have dogma. We need to have a canon that everyone just agrees with. And that is irrational. That's an imposition, right? As an example that was used by Thomas Kuhn is electromagnetism. Because for a very long time, people didn't know what electromagnetism was. There were lots of papers about like, oh, electromagnetism is about this. Other people said, oh, it's about this plus something else. Other people said it's like, it's only some of these things, but not all of them. So for a very long time, debates were interminable about what electromagnetism is all about, right? At some point, there was a consensus that said, okay, let's all just agree. Let's all just agree that electromagnetism is A, B, and C, and nothing else. And because they accepted that dogma, that irrational imposition, they had even more studies that built on this body of knowledge. And that is the foundation of all science in general. So it's not super objective, right? Everyone is wearing rose tinted glasses. Everyone has the same bias. And also, because science is done by individual scientists who are biased, science ends up getting that bias as well. But of course, you can respond to this as well. You can respond to this point by saying that it's about scientific community. The scientific community, if one person has a bias, another person can correct for that bias. And the scientific community taken together confirm some parts but exclude some biased parts, and the what remains will be the unbiased part that everyone can see. So this is called intersubjectivity. But according to Thomas Kuhn, even if you have that process, everyone is still wearing the same glasses. Everyone has the same bias, right? Yun. So why even are we talking about this? Because it's useful to consider religions in the context of a market, right? The marketplace of ideas. So you want to take a look at the religious economy as well. So if you want to ban proselytization or evangelization or trying to convert people in economically depressed areas, or if you're talking about this house like the Pope, let's talk about the religious economy, right? What are they selling? Yeah. The religious economy is when you apply economic and rational choice concepts, religion and religious behavior in general. It's relevant when you say that people, believers, are consumers in their relations with or religious organizations. And religious organizations are producers or suppliers that compete with each other on a political market. So economics is all about the interactions between the producer and the consumer. Producer or the supplier is the one that creates the good, and consumer is the one who uses that good. So what we're talking about here are religious goods, like salvation, like rituals, like absolutions, like communions, etc. The producers or entrepreneurs or suppliers, they're the ones who create it. They're the only ones who can create, but they compete with each other. And the good that they're giving. So all of them want to give you salvation. All of them want to give you peace. But the way that they do it varies slightly. So it's just like everyone wants a bag. And you have different brands of bags, and they all give the same experience of having a bag in slightly different ways. The same thing, right? And that's why it's very useful to me because you can now apply what you learn in econ in religion. So here are some basic ideas. One basic idea is religious organizations are economic entities that operate within a particular market. So that market can be a political system or society at large. The other one is the goods that they sell to their members and the promise of salvation and sacraments and good vibes, sometimes literally. So Pope Leo X in the 1500s literally sold pieces of paper that said you are forgiven and you need to pay money in order to do that. There's a great economic story here because what happened there was they needed that money to rebuild a church. They didn't have that much money. And that's the reason why Pope Leo sold indulgences. So economics and religion, they fit together in many different ways, right? But if we're talking about economics, there's supply and demand. So how does religion create demand? According to Poggi, the monopolistic suppliers, unworldly hope, create the demand for their commodity by fostering fear and trembling. Even if we accept that humans are naturally predisposed to religion, it's still necessary to secure the adherence to this religion instead of any other. The reason why see President Snow nandyan is because he said the reason why we have the Hunger Games, which is all about fear, it's all about trembling, it's to inspire hope. And that's the same thing that religions want to do. The strategies that different religions might use include sharply contrasting this world and the other world. So that's one. Another is presenting the this world as the source of misery and suffering. So recall the Christian motives of vanitas and that's macabre. And the afterlife, the other world is eternally blissful. So buy into our religion so you may have heaven. So the role of religious functionaries is PR, public relations. So again, President Snow in the first Hunger Games movie or book talked to Seneca Crane, the game master, and asked why they even had the games. They just wanted to intimidate people. They would get people from different districts and execute them. So really, it was about giving them hope because hope is the only thing that's stronger than fear. The purpose of the Hunger Games is to justify the absurdity of the world that they live in. If you buy into the Hunger Games, you buy into the system. The same thing. If you buy into the fear, you also buy into the hope. And if you buy into that, you're more likely to buy into the system to the exclusion of any other religion. So they're competing in terms of how do you foster fear and how do you foster hope. Okay. Things that businesses do, that religions do as well. Quality control is done through excommunication. Mergers and acquisitions are done by absorbing various aspects of other religions. There are Greek myths and the Jesus story. So in the Last Supper, I think by the time that I release this, Last Supper, no, actually Last Supper is today, Thursday, right? And then tomorrow will be crucifixion. That's Friday. Okay, by the time you're seeing this, yesterday, Thursday, they had the Last Supper and they drink. Reason why they got that from ancient Greek pagan societies that drink in order to feel closer to the divine. Jesus is one of Krishna's avatars in Hinduism. Santa is a bastardization of Odin. So what happened was there's a legend that during the winter solstice, I think Odin would ride Sleipnir, his eight-legged horse, who is, by the way, the child of Loki. Loki got impregnated by a stallion and gave birth to Sleep and rode through the skies looking for wicked children in order to punish them. So the eight-legged horse became the eight reindeer, and Odin became Santa. It was absorbed. By the way, Rudolph, the red-nosed reindeer, was the ninth reindeer. He wasn't part of the original eight. He was created as a marketing stunt for a convenience store. 100% true. Look at that. And Christmas, this is cliche, but Christmas is a pagan celebration, right? So mergers and acquisitions, they do that. They do a hostile takeover of other religious, of aspects of other religions. Vertical integration also happens. Vertical integration is when, okay, let's say that you want to create a chair, right? So there must be someone who is cutting down the trees. There's someone who is making the chair. There's someone who's selling the chair to the company. And then the company distributes the chairs to different retailers. So there's a supply chain there. Vertical integration would be what if the seller of what if the seller of the chairs at retail also acquired the people who delivered the chairs to them? Or what if they also acquired or bought the people who made the chairs, the manufacturers? Or what if they buy or acquire people who cut down the trees? That's vertical integration. And in the context of religion, there's a hierarchy in the church where even like local communities have a religious leader. And that religious leader talks to the bishop, and then bishops talk to whatever the book. And that hierarchy allows it to penetrate any community in the same way that retailers are acquired in order for the company to be penetrate that particular community. There are also attack ads on other businesses. You have religious figures who do attack ads on other religions. So I think which one was this? Parang ang dating daan or something. There was a case before where there was a religious leader. I'll look it up again later, but there was a religious leader who said bad things about Catholicism, like they do a lot of things that aren't in the Bible. And as a result of that, they got banned by MTRCB. So this was eventually lifted, I think. Actually, no, scratch that. Baka fake news here. But yeah, that happened. They were banned by MTRC. So they sometimes do attack ads on other businesses. Another one is expansion and become multinational corporations. So at first you start in a local community, but eventually you want to spread all around the world. So if you watch Book of Mormon, the whole story is about spreading the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to places like Uganda. So it becomes a multinational religion. And lastly, you want to compete with alternatives to religion in the same way that Netflix said that the real competitor is sleep. And that's the thing that religious are. Their competitor is politics or something like that, or philosophy. So let's explain the evolution of religion next. So evolution is, sorry, the religion is selling salvation or other things like God's grace. The religion really wants people to buy their stuff, but people do not know the value of the thing they're buying until after it's bought. So if you're buying, quote unquote, buying, let's say communion by eating, you don't really know the value of that because you don't know how much it brings you closer to heaven. The only exception is if you're buying it at the point of your death, like anointing the sick. So at this point, buyers can only take the seller's word for it when they choose to buy the religious good. There's no Yelp for heaven. So there's an information asymmetry. It's an information asymmetry. And this information asymmetry means that what you're trying to buy, salvation, and the seller or the broker, yeah, you are not sure whether what they're selling is actually good. So you need a broker. So think about it like lemons or cars. You want to buy a nice car, but you don't know how to identify a nice car. So you're going to pay a broker to tell you ano yung magandang kotse na bilhin. So you need to trust the broker in buying the car. And that's the same thing with the religion. They're the broker. The reputation of the broker matters because if the broker, in this case the religion, is trustworthy, you would say it's more likely because you don't know how to get closer to God, how to go to heaven. So the only thing that you can do is trust this religion, this organization that claims to know how to do it. The reputation of the seller matters. So the seller, the broker, the religion has an incentive to earn people's trust. And you can say that this is the reason why religions, although they evolve slowly, they nevertheless evolve. And you can use this to talk about things like electing the Pope, more reforms, exposing the gay network in the Vatican, etc. But what is holding evolution back? So you can take a look at it in a clear box or black box perspective as well. So using clear box, you can say that Pope Francis will have less power in the Vatican itself is liberal. So the optimal level of evolution is the exact amount of evolution that will increase support in believers. So the marginal increase in support, you would say that's marginal revenue if that is equal to the decrease in support in church officials. So if you become any more liberal than this, the increase of believers or the increase of support would be smaller compared to the increase of disappointment from church officials. You know, yun. So there is a diminishing marginal utility in increasing support. So the first time that Pope Francis said, I support gay people, that's a lot of support. Wow, this is a new age. But by the 15,000th time he's done it, the increase in support will go down. On the other hand, costs go up. Costs here is disappointment in more conservative members of the church. The first time that he says he supports gay people is, that's weird, but fine. But the 50,000 is so at some point, right? The increase in disappointment and the increase in is higher than the increase in support. So just before that, when they're equal, that's the optimal level of. We learned this in microeconomics. But the black box view of it is the church will have less supporters. It's too liberal. So the optimal level of evolution would be if the increase in liberal believers would be for the next level of being liberal or progressive. The next part of it is if it is equal to the decrease in conservative beliefs. Yan siya. Okay, so at some point, the decrease in conservative believers will be greater than the increase in progressive believers. So just before that, when things are equal between them, that's the optimal level of evolution. So the stopping point is when marginal revenue equals marginal costs, or right before marginal revenue is less compared to marginal costs. So you can find a transactional model of converting people to your religion. So religions are convert maximizing. You want to maximize the number of people who believe in the religion, but there's an opportunity cost involved in proselytizing or evangelizing or converting in one area over another. So we want to operate in areas that will most likely get converts. So these are areas that are vulnerable, who need help the most, and who aren't catered to by the state. Those areas will be chosen. Bintanggap at the land missionary, which is why in Book of Mormon, pumunta sila sa Uganda. So, suppose two areas. Area 1 has less potential converts, but it's more economically depressed. And Area 2, which is not as poor, but still poor, has more potential converts. The religion most likely will prioritize Area 2, which is less poor, less vulnerable, but has more potential converts. So um, ito yung dahil convert maximizing. So those who actually need help the most will probably not get it. So their target is more populous areas. Religions will prioritize less poor area if they can get more converts that way. So ito yung Fotelling's model of spatial competition. Look at that. The problem with this approach is you aren't looking at why religion is a source of satisfaction that people want to maximize. Why is this product, salvation, something that you can't verify? Why is it so attractive to people? So it's not enough to think about the law. It's not enough to think about it as a political system. It's not enough to think about it as an economic good. You also need to talk about the psychology of the consumer. And it's precisely why we need to talk about religion's effect on individuals. It's easy to do away with it in the debate about should we try to convert people in poor areas because God is equated with food and charity. But it can also be used as a rebuttal because food kasi siya, so you can't refuse. Consent is vitiated. Let's talk about yun nga, the psychology of people. Religion to the individual. Let's talk about why it's important to discuss. Let's talk about religion as pattern recognition, promiscuous ideology, religion as death denial, religion as compensatory control, and the emergence of modern day spirituality. It's the last part of the lecture. So, our approach here is you have to assume that spirituality, there's such a thing as the subjective experiences of the mystic, things that we can't study directly because of its intangibility and because only an individual can have a mystical experience. But when you have a mystical experience, you can't directly communicate to another person. You say, dude, I had a mystical experience. This is what happened to me. That other person can't verify it because a mystical experience is something that you can't explain, can't verify, can't replicate. And it's completely subjective. Okay? Alternatively, we can accept the study of spirituality at a corporal level, but only through its outcomes and symptoms. Yun. Those are the assumptions we have. So, how do our brains make God? Patterns. Yeah? Patterns. What we had, evolutionarily speaking, is that imagine if you were a caveman and you hear rustling in the bushes. Okay? Rustling in the bushes. And you can never like super precisely understand whether there's something or someone in the bushes. So you can either over compensate and see agents or people in the bush when there is none, or undercompensate, which is like, even if there is someone in the bush, I'll just pretend to win it. Evolutionarily speaking, it's more advantageous to see agents when there are none. Because if there is a tiger in the bush, and you did not overcompensate. You undercompensated. So you said, oh, that's probably nothing. You will die. You'll get eaten by the tiger. Which is why our brain, evolutionarily speaking, evolved to see agents when they are not overcompensate. Because that's how we can survive. And that's also the reason why we're so good at seeing patterns. That's the reason why we have religion in general. That the idea that let's do a ritual, something will happen. It's because we've seen a pattern before. The reason why we need to see patterns is because it helps us know how to survive. That's the reason why there are lots of Cheetos at yung mga chichirya. Like a lot of them suspiciously look like Jesus Christ. That's why Diane Dicer also found like a piece of like grilled cheese sandwich, and there was a photo of Jesus on the front, like just spontaneously Jesus on the grilled cheese. So Jesus, Cheetos, and evolutionary psychology, again, our minds are not built for accuracy or truth. They're built for survival. So interpretation happens before you even realize it. It's the bush story, right? The tiger in the bush. So this is pareidolia. Okay, that's the term for it. Interpretation happens before you even realize it. You can see that's the reason why religion is so subjective. It's also why science is super subjective because you interpret the thing that you see even before you realize it. There's no sensory system will be able to perfectly and accurately represent agency of the thing in the bush. You can over You can either overrepresent the agency in the bush or underrepresent it. In survival of the fittest, it's better to overrepresent agency so that you can avoid predators. There's also promiscuous teleology. Teleology means what is the purpose of some. More technically, it's virtue. Virtue. Now, this is from Aristotle, the idea that things have purpose. And our purpose is to flourish. Master, and to flourish, we need to focus on virtues. We need to focus on being the best person you can be perfectly balanced. But teleology in a more general sense is what is the purpose of something. So Deborah Kellerman said they ran a bunch of experiments across different cultural groups and age groups. A common finding for children was they always want to ask why. When you were a kid, you're probably super annoying. You were like, why this? Why? Not just because they're trying to annoy you, although sometimes that is the case. Especially if you act annoyed, they'll be like, "Ha, this is funny. Let me annoy this person." Or, but initially, they keep asking why because they just want to understand what is the meaning of this. Why is there a lion in Manila Zoo? It's because we're here to be entertained and it's quite fun to watch the lion. But why are we entertained by that? Oh, it's because something in the brain. Why did we act like this? And why is that in the brain? And eventually it's like, why do things exist? Why is there a lion anywhere at all? Why are our brains like this? Not just in terms of the process by which we got here, but why are we even here? So across all cultures, children are found to want answers to why things exist. Not how, but why. So how things exist that can be explained by science. Big Bang, causation, laws of science, laws of physics, laws of chemistry, till we get this. But why do we have these laws? Why did we even have the Big Bang? What is the meaning of any of this? This is what religion is for. So Kellerman says there's a God shaped space in the minds of children. Not necessarily the Judeo Christian God, but the answer to why there is something rather than nothing. That's why we have religion. Another idea is death denial. Freud said that religion is wish fulfillment. We wish for security. But Ernest Becker, in his book Denial of Death, religion is symbolic immortality. All culture is a coping mechanism to deal with the knowledge that we have a limited lifespan. We want something to last further than us. We want there to be something greater than us. So when we conceptualize religion, we did it because in religion, we have an opportunity to be immortal. We have an opportunity to transcend this plane. So even when we die, we are not gone. Ernest Becker died shortly after he wrote Denial. But later, Greenberg, Solomon, and Kaczynski, when they wrote The Worm at the Core on the Rule of Death in Life, they said, religion is also terror management. Again, we want our ideas to last beyond ourselves. And what they did was they had experiments. They asked people, okay, hammer this nail into this piece of wood. There's nothing in the room that there's nothing in the room that you can use to hammer the nail in except for a crucifix. So what they did was half of the respondents, they were made aware of their mortality. Okay, you're gonna die, right? Good. Something like that. The other half, they didn't do anything. For the half that they did do anything to, you were like, okay, let me just use the crucifix to hammer this nail. For the other half, they were reminded of their mortality. They refused to use the crucifix to hammer the nail. Another experiment was they looked at how judges set bail. One half, they were not reminded of their mortality. The other half, they were reminded. So for the half that received the treatment, they were reminded of their mortality. They imposed higher sentences on prostitutes and people in general because they want the lessons that these people learned from their judgments to last longer than themselves. When people become nice after near misses, it's because they want to be remembered positively even after they die. Yet, are there atheists in foxholes? John says yes. There's this phrase kasi that says there are no atheists in foxholes. Like when you're about to die, you become a theist. You become religious. So you're about to die. An alternative version of this is there aren't any atheists in law school because you will learn to believe in God talaga. Like, please, sana hindi ako yung matawag for recitation today. Please, sana pumasa ako ng bar after the Holy Week, April 14. Please, pumasa ako. Something like that. you no longer become an atheist because it's life or death. So Jung said when they did a study, yes and no. So what they did was they made a person, again, new treatment group where they were asked to watch a movie or like documentary or something like that, or just absorb information that gave them knowledge about their. And then for the other half, wala. And then after that, there's all of them are supposed to answer a survey that tests whether they believe in God. So yes, there are atheists in foxholes in the sense that all of the atheists, when they answered the survey, all of them were still atheists. And for the people in the treatment group, their answers to the survey became more extreme, right? Statistically, mas extreme, mas atheist yung sagot na natin sa survey. That was the explicit test. So there are atheists in foxhole. The reason for that is, if you're an atheist, you made peace with the idea that there's no afterlife even before you took the survey. So even if you watch that documentary or movie or whatever, you will still accept it. There's no afterlife. But there was an implicit test. That's why yes and no. There was an implicit test, which is how long did it take for you to answer that survey? So for the treatment group, it took them longer to answer that survey. And that implicit test revealed that even though there are still atheists and foxholes, they're still reconsidering if they receive the treatment. Okay, let's say I want to talk about fear event. Is science any better? So you can argue that in Star Wars, right, Darth Vader had a lot of contractions and he's more machine than man now. The reason for that is he wants to not die. His entire arc was about denying death. Not only his own death, not only the death of his wife, but also the death of the empire, the death of peace and order. And science was a way to deny that death. So science isn't really any better. You can use this in like how you think about mortality or how you think about modern medicine. So you can say that science occupies the same niche in our lives as religion. Another thing is compensatory control. This is Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson. He says that it's not just death, but it's also management chaos. You believe in God because the world is chaotic. So you want to believe that there is an orderliness in the universe. So it's not just the denial of death, but the denial of chaos all around us. And Aaron Kay took that further and asked the question, what happens to religious belief when your confidence in another external entity like the government is challenged? What they found was compensatory control. They found that when governments are less effective or less stable, there are more powerful religious forces. Religion is generally more influential when governments are less influential. There's compensatory control there. So when you're trying to evangelize in poor areas, is it really just God equals food makes people believers? Or could it also be the idea that the government has failed us? There is no order here, which is why we turn to religion because religion gives us that sense of order. Compensatory control also makes more believers when things are getting rough. But remember that sad times make people more protective of their own faith. So we have more believers during a time when government is unstable. But if the government is unstable and things are going bad for everyone, those believers might be more extreme, might be more protective of their own faith. So make with that what you will, because right now you might say that the government is ineffective. You can also say that we're not living in very good times. What does that mean for compensatory control? Lastly, God of the gaps. So my professor, Earl Fronda, wrote supernaturalism is unwittingly naturalist. The idea here is God is a placeholder name for everything that I can't explain with science. Okay? So, ito yung God of the gaps. This is a fallacy, by the way. The idea we don't know how this works, therefore it must be God. That's a fallacy. But it's also the idea that it's a placeholder name. So eventually, when we learn something else in science, we decrease the idea of what supernaturalism is. So the idea of Professor Fronda is that supernaturalism is tied to naturalism, in the sense that as what we know about the natural world increases, what is supernatural decreases. Therefore, the idea of supernaturalism has no importance at all. It's just a placeholder. But you can advance this argument even further to defend religion and say that even if we expand everything there is to know, there's something that science will never be able to answer, which is why we are here. And why we're here is something that you can only answer with God. But again, this might still be part of the natural world, why we are here. Let's say that maybe we weren't created by God, but rather by aliens. Or we have something in our DNA where we do have a purpose. Right? Our purpose might be to discover that. Neil deGrasse Tyson went on Joe Rogan's podcast and said that this is something we're still working as a scientific community. So maybe religion might have it, maybe science might have it. What's important is it's what you can't explain. That's where God is. What you don't have an answer for, and that can be meaning. Science might not be able to answer whether there is any meaning to anything, right? Yun. Modern development of spirituality. So what you see here is there are two lines of evolution in Western spirituality. Belief in a personal higher being. So ito yung the argument from degrees. So personal as in may personality siya. So yung argument from degrees says that we have this concept called good. So there must be like a super good thing. And that's what we call God. Yeah, super benevolent. Omnibenevolent, actually. Another one is human personhood that has a spiritual nature. God is not personal. So ito yung unmoved mover, first cause, and necessity. All of these say that can't help but posit that there is an uncaused cause or an unmoved mover, or it is necessary for God to exist in order for all of causation to exist, the cause of causes, right? So we have a spiritual nature in a sense that we're part of that chain of causation. But God is not necessarily personal. The philosopher's God. This is also, if I'm not mistaken, Jose Rizal's God. So when Thomas Aquinas is talking about the unmoved mover, first cause, necessity as arguments for why God exists, that's not different from what Stephen Hawking believes as well. Stephen Hawking also believes that there's an unmoved mover, first cause, a necessary reason why things exist, but it's not necessarily personal. Stephen Hawking, other atheists might even agree with some things that Thomas Aquinas says. Doesn't necessarily have to be personal. Tracy says that the split can be explained science and the questioning of traditional church-based spirituality in light of modern events. But another thing is the emergence of the second kind of spirituality, scientific or the spiritual nature of people. Like, I'm spiritual but not religious. It's chaotic. Because some academic disciplines are more amenable to spirituality than others. And a theory there is the nature of the discipline and its closeness to the human search for meaning. Nursing, one of the fields with a maturing spirituality, they confront issues like suffering and death on the daily. So you can see now the trend happens because people are closer to death. They want to find meaning. That the means like business no longer just deal with success or money, but also increasingly deal with the human need for significance. So there might be more spirituality in business as well. And that's the reason why a lot of CEOs do mindfulness stuff, myself included. I do a lot of like spiritual mindfulness stuff in the morning. Like they sometimes say that it's the key to their success, right? Because they feel significant. It empowers them in their day. So you can say that like the closer you are to the human search for meaning in your field, the more likely it is that you become more spiritual. Yeah. So talk about faith-based rehabilitation, about personalizing economically depressed. So that's it for today for this lecture. I hope that you had a happy Holy Week. If you watch this during the Holy Week, wow, thanks. But if not, like, thank you as well for listening wherever you might find this. You learn something. I learned a lot while researching for this. I researched on this for actually quite a lot of years. I've been studying religion ever since I was a child, as I was devout Catholic. And then somewhere along the way, I became an atheist. Then in college, I became agnostic. And law school, I became theist, but only because I wanted to deal with uncertainty. But now so you might have different places in your journey, and that's all valid. I'm not going to say that you should be religious. I think this time it's all about respect. Just don't disrespect people. Just be nice to everyone. Understand where you can improve, stuff like that. And we can all use debate as a way to understand one another and move forward towards a more just world. But if you don't like that I believe in God, that's fine also. I don't really care. Like we're all gonna die. Like wherever we end up, what matters is how we treat each other. So that's it for this lecture. Bye.